Hi everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 10th of November, where we are talking about 3 chapters: delivering speeches, culture, and also audience. And that basically would put us through most of the textbook, believe it or not. There will be other chapters coming up over the semester that would be applicable to the informative speech and to the persuasive speech, but I wanted you to have those chapters up front as we are getting ready for our first speech, which happens to be a 5-minute autobiographical speech. So what I did last class was I asked you to contact me in terms of whether or not you thought you would be uploading your speech. And what I will do is I will add a section onto our Moodle site so that you can upload. And if you look in the notes below, you can see that 4 of you have gotten back to me about that, indicating that you want to upload your speech. And then also to let me know if you want to present your speech via Zoom. And if so, what your times of availability would be for the date which we have scheduled on our course outline for that first speech. Now, thus far, I only have one individual who has indicated interest in doing Zoom. So my hope is that there will be at least one other person so that we can do Zoom, so there would be some kind of an audience. If you'll remember, speech number 1 is going to be next Tuesday on the 17th. So if you haven't contacted me yet about your mode of delivery for the speech, please let me know. I also asked you to contact me and let me know how you wanted to proceed with the practice session. I wanted to touch base with each of you and see how things were going with the speech. And you had lots of opportunities of choice. You could do so via email, and I believe there were 3 of you thus far that indicated you wanted to do your speech via email. Or you could do a practice session via Zoom. And I believe there was 1 of you who indicated that, and we're arranging a time. You've also got the option of via telephone, and you can see all of that listed out as well in our notes. So if it turns out that you haven't yet contacted me, please do so that I can fill in those blanks. And in terms of the notes below, what I've been trying to do was to indicate the main points of what I've been discussing in my classes. And in fact, what I'm doing is using these notes to make these videos, and then I'm just posting these notes up for you so you get to actually see my notes. And this is related to the sample outline that I was talking about last class. That outlines are very important in terms of pulling together a speech, though they're also very individual, and there are lots of different ways you can do outlines. One is not necessarily better than another, but usually less is more, keywords and phrases. And if you want an example of an outline, you can just look below this video, and you can see that what I've got are main sections. For instance, section 1, delivering speeches, section 2, culture, section 3, audience, and section 4, watching sample autobiographical student speeches. And then under each of those sections, I've got subpoints that I wanted to talk about. I'm not using complete sentences, just keywords and phrases that will help remind me to talk about things. For instance, under delivering speeches, which is in chapter 10, that there are 3 different kinds of speeches you can deliver. An extemporaneous speech is prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. That's what we are practicing in our class. But you can also have an impromptu speech that's done at the spur of the moment with no prior preparation. Usually it's done when someone is unaware. For instance, they've been offered an award, for instance. And I usually suggest that you try to avoid these speeches. And if you are ever put in a position when you're asked to make a speech and you weren't necessarily expecting to do so, keep it short and keep it simple so that you're less likely to make mistakes or do something that could be embarrassing. There also is a manuscript speech, where I know a lot of times students think that that would be the ideal way to deliver a speech, where you could read it from either a manuscript, from a piece of paper, or a teleprompter. Now, I can tell you that in terms of being able to interact with the audience, it's not such a great idea to read from a manuscript. There are situations where that's considered to be appropriate. For instance, in academic conferences when you're reading a paper. But that is the exception, not the rule. The assumption is that you're trying to have some sort of interaction with your audience, which is why teleprompters have become so popular, that technology allows you to look into the camera but also read at the same time. However, while I myself have never used a teleprompter, you've got to be, I believe, quite skilled at using one well so that it doesn't sound like you're reading. And even if you are skilled, things can go wrong. And you can see that in the notes below, I have a link for you to watch. It's approximately 3 or 4 minutes about a teleprompter fail. As I'm fond of saying, you can't make this stuff up. And this happened to be from a very famous movie producer and director, where he was talking about some television innovations that were going on, and he had a teleprompter difficulty, and he announces in the middle of what he was discussing that he has a teleprompter difficulty, and then he's unable to basically think and speak on his own accord without his teleprompter, so he rushes off stage, and it's quite embarrassing. And obviously, he's very skilled with speaking in front of audiences. He would have to be for his profession. But in that particular moment, you can see how it all fell apart. So keep that in mind, that a teleprompter may not necessarily make things easier for you. But again, what we are doing is the extemporaneous speech, which is prepared in advance and delivered with a speaking outline. Now, some of you might be tempted to do a memorized speech, and I suggest you don't do that, as the Toastmasters video indicated, because it will sound memorized, and also it's highly likely that you will forget pieces. That said, a memorized speech could perhaps be effective for a very brief or a very formal event, something like a toast at a wedding, for instance. But that wouldn't be our kinds of speeches. Thinking about the delivery of speeches, things like voice. You want to be conversational. Again, you don't want to sound like you're reading. You want to be much more informal. Sentences are shorter. Vocabulary is simpler than what you would find in a piece of writing. You want to vary your volume and your speed. So you don't want to speak in a monotone. You do want to make sure that you've got some emotional inflections, and that once you vary things like volume and speed, then you're more likely to keep your audience's interest. You want to enunciate, which means that you're not mumbling. That said, that's different than pronunciation, which is how perhaps you might say a word, and that can vary. And that oftentimes can vary with something like region, for instance, or it can vary by culture, for instance. And then there's some words that we haven't seemed to be able to reach consensus with. Things like, is it Caribbean or Caribbean? Is it harassment or harassment? That said, you are not going to be able to change your pronunciation over a short period of time. So you shouldn't be worried about that. And if English is not your first language and you are concerned about your pronunciation, you might even want to say that at the beginning of your speech, letting your audience know if they're having difficulty understanding how you are pronouncing your words, to please let you know. And that puts the burden of responsibility on us as audience members rather than on you. That is different from enunciation. I can really hear what you're saying, which is what I've just illustrated, where you're mumbling. So you want to make sure that you are clearly articulating things. Proxemics. And proxemics is the use of space. It's a very complex discipline, but it can be very, very important in how an audience receives a speech. There's a lot of thought put into things like seating arrangements, for instance, and distance between speaker and audience. Again, we're losing some of this in our new reality with uploading student speeches, but it's still something to consider. Affect display, facial expressions, and basically audience members will probably pay more attention to your affect display, your facial expressions and body language, than to any of your content. And while that may not be fair, it's just the reality of the world that we tend to be influenced by what we see first and then content later. The best example of this was a presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. And this was a very famous debate because it was the very early days of television. So approximately half of the audience heard that debate on the radio, and the other half heard or watched that debate on television. And the pollsters got two very different kinds of results from the audience members who listened to the debate, or as opposed to the audience who watched the debate. And those audiences who listened and didn't have visuals, in other words, they were listening to the radio, in mass, basically, they argued that Richard Nixon won that debate because of content. However, the individuals who watched the debate on television came to a completely different conclusion, saying that the majority of those individuals said that Kennedy won that debate because he appeared presidential and calm, and he appeared to be handsome. More so than Richard Nixon. And for better or for worse, Richard Nixon was known as a sweater, and I'm not talking about an article of clothing. Basically, under those hot lights, he would visibly sweat, so he looked uncomfortable, and he also refused to wear makeup, which is a terrible thing to do, but these were the early days of television. He didn't understand that by not wearing makeup he would look very washed out, and Kennedy did the exact opposite. And it really wasn't too long ago, with a presidential debate. I want to say that it involved John Kerry, but I can't necessarily remember. But that said, um, there were discussions about temperature in the debate hall, and there's just a difference of a couple of degrees here or there, but Kerry, for better or for worse, was also known as a, quote, sweater. So his opposition wanted the room to be as warm as possible, and consequently he and his team wanted the room to be as cool as possible. And we're talking about a difference of, again, a couple degrees, but it goes to show how ultimately something that minor can prevent a political debate. And certainly we've seen how debates have changed to become media events ever since that Nixon-Kennedy debate. So it's very important from a political perspective. But I use this as an example in that audiences are likely to respond to the presentation first and to the content second. And we have some sample student speeches to watch at the ending of today's video, and I think you might find that when you're watching those sample student speeches. Gesturing can be very important as well. You can think about conventional gestures. Usually these are gestures that are assigned meaning by custom, something like a thumbs up being good or an okay sign if you've got the thumb and the forefinger circled and then the other three fingers raised. That can get you into a lot of trouble because one culture might have a very different meaning for a particular gesture. It's one of the reasons why military spend a good amount of time talking about things like nonverbal communication in different cultures, where they could end up insulting a culture, not even realizing that a benign gesture in the United States could have a terrible meaning somewhere else. There are also descriptive gestures. These are much more universal because they show things like size and shape and location. Very useful when you're trying to visualize something for an audience. And there are also indicators that can express feelings, something like slamming a fist on a table to emphasize a point. And lastly, there's eye contact, which we expect to be varied across audiences. Again, you may not necessarily have an audience if you are presenting via video, but at the very least, you want to be looking at the video screen as if you are presenting to the audience. Eye contact can be very culturally based as well. There are some cultures where making direct eye contact is seen to be rude, especially with a superior. Asian and sometimes Latin cultures feel that way. But at least in terms of the West and the United States culture, the idea of eye contact means that you've got engagement and interest in what's going on. Now, that said, as I've said about public speaking, it's all smoke and mirrors. It doesn't necessarily have to be that you're making eye contact with every single member of the audience. It only has to look like you're making eye contact with every single member of the audience. So looking at the top of heads, or the two corners of the room in the center, or three friendly faces that happen to be seated apart from one another can give you that feeling. And again, for those of us who aren't going to have the opportunity to have a live audience, well, then we are speaking probably to a screen, and we want to try to speak to the screen as if we were speaking to a person as much as possible. But I understand the difficulties involved with that. In terms of thinking about culture, which was our next chapter, a culture in its widest definition is any kind of group membership. And I guess we could debate whether two people is a group or just a pair, but certainly three or more is a group. And the idea behind this group membership is that anybody who belongs to a group, they have shared qualities. That said, they also have individual characteristics. So we need to be really careful not to stereotype or to generalize and assume that everyone in the group is the same. But generally speaking, we can see how a culture can influence behavior. These are actions that we take, and it can even include things like conversational style, if we tend to be very direct or very indirect in the way that we speak. That could be based on one's particular culture or individual preference. The same with attitudes, which are feelings that you might have that definitely can be individual, but also can be based on your culture or your group membership. Beliefs, thinking that something is true or false, can also be influenced by culture. And values, which are the highest or hardest things of all to change. They basically encompass behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs. In other words, there's a certain element of predictability. There's a predictive element in culture that if you know if somebody belongs to a particular culture, it's likely they might engage in a particular behavior or have a particular attitude or a particular belief. It's one of the things pollsters do when they are trying to determine political affiliations. It's one of the things advertisers do when they're trying to determine the demographics or the audience characteristics watching the particular show or that particular form of media. Now, of course, we live in a multicultural society, many cultures, and that we belong to hundreds, if not thousands of cultures, each of us. Some are very broad, things like gender or education or sexual orientation or age or ethnicity. And then some can be very, very specific. It could be based on interests. For instance, those individuals who are hockey fans. It could be based on a location. It could be something like New England, or New Englanders, I should say. It could be based as small as something like our public speaking class at Greenfield Community College this semester, that all of us as a group have a culture, for better or for worse, that there are certain behaviors and attitudes and values that we will probably share in common, even though we have individual difference. And I've certainly heard of individuals talking about that there is a culture of college students. You can sort of predict what they might wear or what they might believe. And there is a culture for community college students. And if we were to get even more specific, there is a culture for Greenfield Community College students. I've had many GCC students tell me they've attended other schools, both community colleges and not, and that GCC is different, not necessarily better or worse, but we have our own behaviors and attitudes and values and beliefs. And even something that seems to be set, something that seems to be objective like time, can be culturally based. And I always think about a story that one of my colleagues, Dovia Fessi in the history department, who sadly passed away a few years ago, used to share. And he was originally from Africa, and he was talking about the differences between Africa and the United States. And he was talking specifically about time and bus schedules. And I'll always remember this story when he talked about that in the United States, the bus leaves at a particular time. 3:12, for instance. Whether the bus is full or empty is irrelevant, but there's a schedule that needs to be kept because there are other people waiting along the way, and we have to keep to the schedule, at least from the American philosophy. From the African philosophy, completely different. The bus would never leave if it were empty, just because it was 3:12. The bus would leave when there were enough people on the bus to justify it leaving. It could be 3:12, or it could be much after that. And the idea is that time is not something that necessarily should be it should be considered to be completely objective. That basically, if you're waiting for the bus at 3:25, Well, the bus gets there at 3:45. In other words, the bus gets there whenever it gets there, and you wait until it gets there. And I know that in America we say, well, I have obligations because I've got a job that starts at a particular time, let's say 4 o'clock. And the African philosophy would be that job will continue whether you're there or not at 4 o'clock. So if you get there at 4:20, that's when you begin. That philosophy would suggest that we begin class when everyone is present and we end class when we're done, whether it be 5 minutes or 5 hours. Again, it's a very different way of seeing the world. I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's better or worse, but just different to illustrate how culture can influence someone's belief structure. And this is directly related to audience, which is directly related to you as a public speaker, that you are going to have individuals in your audience who belong to multiple cultures. If you can try to get a sense as to which cultures they might belong to, you might be able to adapt your speech accordingly. But keep in mind how complex this might be because, again, we belong to dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of cultures. And we are also not just subject to our cultural influences, but to our individual influences. So we don't necessarily have to engage in a particular behavior or belief or attitude because we belong to a particular cultural group, let's say a particular political affiliation. I used this word previously. It's called demographics. These are the observable characteristics of individuals in a group, and advertisers oftentimes use this, things like age, gender, ethnic background, education, political affiliation, religion, and so forth, to try to determine what products might be of particular appeal to individuals of that particular group. And again, there is a predictive element to it, but it's not foolproof. The text also talked about something in relation to hostile audiences. I doubt any of you would ever be in that situation. Usually, someone is well aware where they're walking into a situation where they will confront a hostile audience, perhaps in a political situation. But you might have a skeptical audience, and certainly as we start getting to some of our other speeches, the informative and the persuasive, you might find that to be the case. So if that's the case, I don't have a foolproof method for dealing with a skeptical or hostile audience, but some suggestions that could be helpful to establish goodwill, that everybody has the best intentions, to find areas of agreement, that while you might disagree about a great deal, there are also places where you agree, to use credible outside sources. And we'll talk about outside sources in the future for our future speeches, but we want to make sure that these are sources that have a certain level of credibility to them, which is something we'll discuss with the internet because anyone can post anything on the internet. So we've got to be very careful if we decide to use the open internet, which is why it might be more helpful to use electronic sources through a library database, which we will discuss. Being professional so you can at least earn your audience's respect, even if your audience disagrees with you. Using humor, which happens to be the great equalizer. Though humor can be tricky, it can be very culturally based, so you don't want to end up offending somebody. And being multi-sided so that you're trying to be as fair as possible. So those were the 3 chapters that I wanted to cover today. And the way that I wanted to end today was to have you watch 3 sample autobiographical student speeches. You can see that they're included in the notes below, the links, and they're all on YouTube. These students are in no way affiliated with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day you will end up being a sample student speech. But these were uploaded for whatever reason, so I consider them available for public access, which means that we can watch and rewatch and fast forward and rewind and do whatever it is we want to do with these speeches and be much more hypercritical probably than we would ever be with our own speeches of our classmates. That said, as you know, we're all on the journey of public speaking, so our speeches are not going to be perfect. Not that there was ever such a thing as a perfect speech, but we can definitely be harsher with these sample student speeches than we would be with each other because we don't have any kind of personal connection associated with these individuals. So I have 3 speeches for you to watch, and for our attendance question today, I wanted to ask you to list 1 strength and 1 weakness of each of the 3 speeches that I'm having you watch. And again, while you don't have to interact with your peers, I do encourage you to read the responses of your peers as well as my responses, because this will duplicate as much as possible what we might experience during a class. Next class, what I will do is I will briefly talk about all three of those sample student speeches, and we will also have a quiz. The quiz will be 20 questions, short answer mostly, but also perhaps a bit of multiple choice or true false, based on the first set of readings that we've done over the semester. You can look up the answers. If we were in class, that wouldn't be the case, but again, I'm sort of adapting for the situation that we're in. I'm hopeful these are questions that will encourage you to read the book and also will be questions that will be useful to you as you are putting together your speech. And I'm just going to post the quiz and ask you to send me the responses back. If you could just cut and paste. To my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, and then I can return the quiz to you. And next class also would be a class where we can begin seriously thinking about speech number 1, autobiographical speech. So this would be a good time for you anytime this week to make an appointment with me or to make some sort of arrangement with me about when you can present for your practice session. The idea is that you would have some sort of a practice with me prior to the actual delivery of the speeches, which would be on Tuesday. What I'll do with the quiz is I'll give you 24 hours to complete that particular quiz and return it back to me. And what I will do with these speeches as well is I'll give you 24 hours to post your speech on the date indicated on our syllabus, and then what that will end up becoming is a attendance question for everyone to respond to. So we will continue on next class. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Enjoy the sample student speeches, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about them. Take care. Bye-bye.